So good morning and welcome, everybody. Who's from out of town? Oh, fantastic. People from snow-bound country like Ottawa and Calgary and that? Yeah. This is quite a nice day compared to what we had before we left. So again, I'm Mike Gerbis. I'm the CEO of the Delphi Group, which is a strategic consulting firm here in Canada, and one of the co-founders of the Emerging Leaders Forum. As you can tell by my hair, I'm not an emerging leader anymore, but I certainly love to get involved, and the organizing committee has kindly allowed me to MC today. So I'm going to be your host for the day, and I hope we have a lot of fun. We're going to do a chaotic exercise with the cards on your table in a second, and it's going to be chaotic because there's so many of you, but we'll give it a go. I wanted to tell you a couple of things. First, a little history. Who's been here before? All right, so we've got a few people come back. So the Emerging Leaders Forum was set up over a decade ago, and a group of us felt that in the sustainability field, felt that the younger generation, was not getting a voice at a lot of these big conferences and that. And we thought, and I think we're right, in that we need your voice and we need your creativity and innovation to help solve some of the emerging and ever increasingly complex problems. So we set up this day. It actually started in Toronto, and probably only 75 or so people at that time, and it's grown significantly. As you can see, we're up over 150 delegates. And that's because of a wonderful group of volunteers. They all have orange lapels there on their, or not lapels, lanyards on their necks. And anytime you see them, I want you to thank them for all their work, because all of them dedicated a huge number of hours to making this happen. And I think you're going to be thrilled by it. So I'll introduce them in a second. Well, why don't I introduce them now? So see if they're in the room here. Is Gwen in the room? Gwen Cottle. So she's outside at the thing. Sarah Jane's at the back. Sarah Jane Walsh. Caitlin Boyd. I saw Caitlin. Oh, outside. Jillian Kelly. Is Jillian all outside? Okay. Maureen Cooper. Elliot Weinstein's at the back. All right. Rachel Ward, who is the big honcho, the lead of all this. Alison Clark, Leor's coming, I think, later. David Fatitis, Melissa Creed in the back. And that's all the volunteers today. So let's give them a hand. So we'll do that several times, okay? Because I think they deserve more than one round of applause, all right? We'll give them a standing ovation at the end of the day. Deal? All right. So we also, we couldn't do this, of course, without money. So a number of you got travel stipends, you got passes into Globe, and that's because of our sponsors. So I'm going to thank them several times, but I want to start off right away. First, thanking Target Canada. They're our first platinum sponsor of the event ever. And Target allowed us to live stream the event, which has been a vision for several emerging leaders. So not only are there 150 here in this room, but hopefully several hundred watching it online. So I hope you're going to tweet and Facebook post and Instagram, whatever it is, and get it out there to your peers across the country, all right? So do as much of that as you want. So we want to thank Target. Suncor and Cenovus Energy are our gold sponsors. Nexen and CN are silver. Bronze, we have ConocoPhillips, Canadian, Meg Energy, the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. And then we have a number of contributing sponsors, including TransCanada, Interface, the Chemical Industry Association of Canada, Brookfield Johnson Controls, West Coast Sightseeing, and then our sustainability partners. So Bullfrog Power is greening the electricity, Carbon Zero providing the offsets, Dig Events, whose Leor's company, you'll meet him later, is making it a zero waste or trying to make it a zero waste, and Ethical Bean, which is providing the organic coffee in that. Our partner for the venue is SFU, so we want to thank them. and also a great organization that I've been part of for well over a decade is Connecting Environmental Professionals. And if you're not members, I encourage you to be members. It's a great organization that has groups in Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. I don't know, are we still in Halifax or no? Anybody know? No. So great organization to network with your peers, mentor, hear wonderful talks and that. So I encourage you to do that. And then our media partner is Eco Canada. So quick round of applause for all them. All right, couple of housekeeping. I mentioned the washrooms. Women's just outside. Here on the left, men's around the stairs. There's also a couple upstairs. Phones, please turn them off. No vibrating, no rings, okay, please. You can have them on, of course, so you're tweeting and doing stuff. Try not to look down at them too much while the panelists are up here. They've given their time for you, and so hopefully you'll be encouraged to listen to them. And emergency exits. Oh, now there's an exit there. I didn't learn that. Who can tell me where the emergency exit? Just straight out the door, is that it? Isn't that bad, eh? First mistake. Okay, so there's an exit right there, of course, and we'll meet just out front of the doors, okay, to go. Any questions around logistics? No? Okay, so the agenda, as you see, you've got a program, a very comprehensive. It's got all the bios, all the agenda, but basically we're going to have an opening panel. Now, we're behind already, but that's all right. We'll catch up over the day. So we have an opening panel on the mega trends driving energy, food, and water nexus, and that's 8:30, 9:30. Then we'll do a transition to the breakout groups. There'll be 3 breakout groups, energy, food, and water. Which I'll go over the room numbers. We'll have a break and you'll get your coffee for those of you that are waiting for that. Then we'll have the Globe pre-panel, which is the competition we're having, which is really exciting. So the Emerging Leaders has not only grown into a bigger session here, but we're now fully integrated within the Globe program. So we have a session beyond 2020, which will have 2 of your colleagues participating in. We also have a Next Generation Award and 2 major scholarships that ARC Resources, Synovus, CN, and the Delphi Group give out every year, $5,000. So that'll be great. We'll grab lunch, and we have a lunch panel, so you're working the full day, so you're going to be good and tired by the end of it. And then we transition into the keynote address by Amory Lovins, which is a fantastic speaker. He's an incredible individual. And then we'll do the speed mentoring, okay, which will be great. You'll have 3 groups, 20 minutes. Really use that to your advantage. Talk, get to know them, and learn as much as you can. And then a keynote speaker by Tom Rand, and we'll then announce the finalists and hopefully wrap up by 5. Does that sound good? All right. So, the chaotic exercise. So you've been introducing yourself to people and that, but you'll see pictures on the table. Now what I want you to do, all right, is I'm going to give you a few minutes, and you're going to stand up. Now people from tables 1 to 8, you have to stay on this side of the room, and everybody else stay on that side of the room. You can get up. There are pictures on the table that you can get up and mingle, and I want you to do 2 things. 1, I want you to find a picture that best represents yourself as you see yourself today. Okay? Today. Okay, wait. Don't do it yet. The second one is, and you don't have to pick from your table. You can get up, okay? And just mingle around. That's why it'll be chaotic. The second is I want you to find a picture that best represents where you want to be in 5 or 10 years with regards to your career or professional person. So now you're going to practice a very key skill that you need in your careers, and that is being concise, right, and key points. So what you're going to do is go around the table and introduce yourself using the cards. So you're going to show the card, tell your name, why does this represent who you are now, okay, whether it's in your career or personally. And then you're going to say where you want to be in 5 or 10 years and show the other picture. All right, so we're good. You just go around the table, maximum a minute or 2 minutes each, max. Okay, because we don't have much time. We want to catch up some time. All right, so go for it. Introduce yourselves and take 10 minutes to do that. So how was that? Interesting? Yeah? It's fascinating, to see how people pick different pictures, sometimes to say the same thing. I heard a lot of people talking about either chaos or multiple paths, right? Choices, lots of choices, and then we want to get to a place of balance, a selected path, right? A peak, right? A pinnacle of something, chosen path, whatever. Is that pretty common? Any outstanding stories where you were blown away by someone? Jumped out? No? Really? Yeah.
This guy right here is a pretty impressive story.
Okay, let's hear it. Stand up. I didn't put you on the spot. These are fascinating people sometimes. Can you do it?
I don't know.
Come on. Oh, you tell the story for him.
I'm gonna mess it up though if I do.
Come on, tell the story. You can do it. What's your name? You introduce yourself.
My name's Mark Taylor. I'm a local here. I go to BCIT. I'm just on the tail end of my sustainable business leadership degree. And in a couple months, I'm going to be sailing from Jamaica to Tahiti on a small catamaran, documenting the plastic as well as the sustainable eco-lodges along the way that we find, and make it into a short documentary film, hoping to bring light to some of the things we see along the way.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Right, I got it. Remind me, I have prizes for people who stand up and do that. So remind me, Mark, I'll get them, all right? Anybody else before I pass on to our panel? Anybody else? Real interesting story? No? Yeah? You ready? All right.
So my name is Sophia. I also live and work here. I work at in Richmond at Kwantlen Polytechnic at the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems. Quite the mouthful. And I think this is remarkable. So Hillary works at a tugboat company right now, and she was just sharing that she's kind of getting to a point where she doesn't feel like her values are lining up with those of industry or her industry. And so she's wanting to move to create a coffee shop, education, food, love affair place. And I think that's really brave and awesome.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks. Great. Okay, let's move on. Do two things for me. Please push all the pictures into the center of the table. Please don't take them. Last time, a couple people decided to take them. All right, they're an expensive set that I use in facilitating that. So please just push them forward, and the volunteers will pick them up later. All right, I'm going to pass it over to our first moderator, Christy here. I'll give you that. So Christy Stevenson is a Canadian leader in the evaluation of corporate environmental, social, and governance risk and opportunities in the capital markets. She is the manager of environmental, social, and governance evaluations and research at NEI Investments. So I'm going to pass her over, and she's going to introduce the panel.
Okay. Am I on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So apparently I have the easiest job in the world today, because typically the moderator has to think of all kinds of great questions to ask the panelists. But I have been promised that there will be no questions needed from me, because this is a very engaged group and you guys will have a lot of questions. So I have some as backup if suddenly the room falls silent, but I've been told we're in good hands. So mega trends driving the energy, food, and water nexus. As mentioned, I work for NEI Investments. We're a mutual fund company owned by the credit union system, and are a social enterprise of sorts in that regard. Our brand, which most people are more familiar with than our corporate name, is Ethical Funds. We're a socially responsible investor, so we integrate environmental, social, and governance considerations into the selection of our investments. And food, energy, and water are all very big issues for us. In Canada, we do have foreign holdings, and we do have small cap and other kinds of products in our portfolios, but principally we are investing in large Canadian companies. And in Canada, for good or for bad, the nature of our capital markets are such that 75% of the TSX Composite, so our large cap, our large stock exchange, by assets or by market cap, are oil and gas companies, mining companies, and the banks, which are largely in the business of financing oil and gas and mining. So we are definitely an extractives economy, and sustainable food production, distribution, and low carbon energy transition and water are all big issues for us. So I'm going to launch into our panel of experts here. First up on on energy, we have Robert Page, Director of the Enbridge Centre of Corporate Sustainability, Professor of the Hastings School of Business. We then have, for food, we're joined by Rebecca Harbert, the Chair of Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and finally by Alexis Morgan, the Director of Global Water Roundtable for the Alliance of Water Stewardship at WWF. And so I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here this morning as someone who is neither emerging nor a leader. That I so look to all of you with both envy and with gratitude in terms of going forward. I'm so delighted to see so many of you out here. I have had a number of interactions in Calgary with the conducting environmental professionals who I greatly admire the work, and I see some of them here today, so that's really great. I want to start off with a very fundamental issue, which is really about intergenerational ethics. And the point is that water, from a long-term point of view, is probably more important for us than energy. So I want to keep that in the background as I go through what I'm saying in the next few minutes. And I also want to say that today in southern Alberta, there are no new water licenses being given. So constraints on water are already beginning to emerge for energy, for tourism, for agriculture, for a variety of in different parts of our country, even though it's so blessed in terms of water resources. I also wanted to say that although I won't be talking about this today, food is the third item on that triangle, and water, which we do not use for energy in southern Alberta, then is water that is available for irrigation of agriculture, essential between Calgary and the Saskatchewan border. So with all of this then, in a period of extreme weather, I could use the term climate change, but in some ways, some of the aspects of climate change on extreme weather are particularly doing. In Calgary, we have the horrible dilemma. We had the worst flooding last June in Canadian history, and yet probably from a long-term point of view, we should be focusing more on drought than just on flooding right now. So these are some of the dilemmas that you see in dealing with the three of us on the panel here this morning. I want to take just a couple of moments to talk about fossil fuels, the focus of so much public discussion these days. Fossil fuels, which are an important feature for British Columbia, with the new gas fields in the northeast, for Alberta, and for Saskatchewan in connection with it. And in looking at all of this, we're going through a revolution right now. And it's a revolution that's very important to understand the full implications of, from conventional to non-conventional oil and gas production. Whether you're looking at fracking for shale gas production, or you're looking at the oil sands, this is a whole new phase. This is a whole new area. For some, this is a whole new industry, almost in terms of impacts that we're looking at. And so if we begin to look, for instance, at the oil sands, we look at the water requirements in connection with this, which are huge per barrel and which are gradually declining today in terms of their needs with recycling, with non-potable water use, and with other aspects of it. But we still have a long way to go there. Suncor, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, these are companies that are leading some of the new breakthrough technologies in connection with it. Or with fracking, where we're actually disrupting and breaking up the geological structure in order to allow that gas or that oil to flow. With high pressure, hydraulic and chemical and sands in order to do that. And once again, the impacts, largely in many parts of North America still unregulated, need to be addressed in connection with it. And behind it all, we're making progress on water, we're making progress on land reclamation, but greenhouse gases are still awaiting the new technology breakthroughs of the 20s or the 30s. But in all of this, water becomes critical in terms of process of energy development, and we're using more and more energy today to produce energy in connection with it. Or coming back to BC and hydro, I was on a panel in California a year or so ago, and all 4 of the panel members were talking about the variability of the snowpack from California, currently under huge drought, all the way to Alaska, up through British Columbia and Alberta. And the one thing that became so clear, and right now today we're renegotiating for British Columbia the Columbia River Treaty, in which the Americans are making more expectations of what the final product will be, and water then becomes a matter in dispute for energy between Canada, principally British Columbia here, and Bonneville and the United States. Or we go to nuclear. And in nuclear, I was on a panel a couple of years ago with the head of Bruce Energy, the president of Bruce Energy, the big nuclear organization in Ontario. And I said to him, you seem to have just dropped your proposal for a new nuclear power plant in northwest Alberta. And he said to me, yes. And I have one word in reply, and the word is water. If you look at where the nuclear power plants in Ontario, they're all on the Great Lakes. Alberta doesn't have any Great Lakes. They're called sloughs, and they don't even deserve to be called lakes. So we have that. Or with coal-fired power or gas-fired power, you use enormous amounts of water for cooling, for thermal cooling in connection with it, with thermal impacts flowing from it. And today we see huge quantities of new natural gas coming into the mixture in North America. The cheapest and the most attractive way for investment in new power facilities, with the exception of a few nuclear sites, a few hydro sites in North America. So what we come back to here is in all of these, including renewables, including the way in which renewables, because they have interruptible power, then require back supply from hydro or from gas, principally right now. So all of these things bring us back to what is, from my point of view, the most important thing we have to do with energy, and that is follow a systems approach where everything is interlinked to everything else, where when you do, as Ontario did, closing coal-fired power plants without finding alternative means of generation, then you have problems ahead and usually significant price increases. Or secondly, in connection with this, just in closing, I am a firm believer that we must move to a system of pricing for both carbon and for water. I don't see any in our free enterprise economy. I don't see an alternative to putting a price signal for both of these critical commodities for life. They're not just for economics, but certainly in terms of water for life. And lastly, and very simply, efficiency and conservation. We still have a lot to go in terms of that. We look at our own households. I certainly tried with my own in Calgary, and we have huge potential there. And it's a kind of no-brainer because it's an economic benefit usually from a long-term point of view as well as an environmental one. So just in finishing up then very quickly, I have grandchildren, and every time I see pictures of my grandchildren, I come back to what I started with, is the way in which energy, water, and food are an intergenerational issue. an ethical issue from an intergenerational point of view. For my generation, we did a pretty poor job of it, and we look forward to your much better progress in terms of these areas. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about food, sort of something everyone can relate to and love. And I'll start off by just saying agriculture, as we know it today, is actually incredibly different from agriculture that was existing even 50 years ago. So we have gone to very energy intensive, water intensive, technology and capital intensive production of food. And at the same time, we used to have 40% of the North American population engaged in food production, and now we're down to less than 2% producing a whole lot of food. But it's come at a pretty dramatic cost. And the way we produce food today has changed very, very rapidly. And I just like to start with that because it's a real example of how things can go through massive changes in relatively short periods of time. The way our food system operates today is totally different from the way it did 50 years ago. And it will hopefully be totally different 50 years from today under your leadership. So I want to hit on four major trends that we see in food production today. The first one being this decrease in food security and food sovereignty. So despite all of our great technologies and advances, quote unquote, in agriculture, we have unprecedented amounts of food insecurity. We've got 1.2 billion food insecure people. Here in Canada even, we have 2.5 million Canadians that are food insecure. In the last decade, we've seen a doubling of the price of food, which is an astronomical number, especially if 80% of your income goes towards food. A doubling of food costs really is not manageable, is it? You can't budget your way out of that one. The food crisis of 2008, if you remember, left more people hungry than any period of time in history up until that point. And closer to home, the Yukon Territories last year was cut off from their food supply because of a mudslide that occurred on the highway that went up there. And as a result, within 2 days, their food supply was essentially gone. Those are some pretty scary margins to be operating on. So this has really exposed some pretty massive vulnerabilities in our food system. And it's also exposed the loss of food sovereignty. So communities that in the past have been able to provide food for themselves and grow food for themselves have gradually just lost that capacity, both in land and knowledge and resource base has just disappeared as we've sort of moved towards this more globalized sort of method of producing food. So that's the big first kind of depressing trend. Okay, the second one is really this consolidation of production and this consolidation of power actually within the food system. So as we've been intensifying production, markets have actually become very globalized, as we all know. And there's also been a concentration in the actual production of food. So where we produce food is really based on what is the most economically benefit location to produce food. Probably our most relevant example for us here on the West Coast is California. So last year, California produced $18.8 billion worth of agricultural exports, largely fruits and vegetables. Does anyone know what fruits and vegetables are mostly composed of? Water. So they exported a whole lot of incredibly valuable water to other people in other regions. And with that food left water. This water, you really are the star of this show here, right? So water is a real critical component. But this, by concentrating all that production there, it basically costs the people that live on that land the value of their most precious resource, water. And now this year, California producers are taking thousands of acres out of production because they already know they don't even have close to the amount of water they need to actually produce the food that they typically grow on that land. So the communities of California are paying a pretty high price for the efficiency of producing crops in their backyard. So driving this consolidation is really this effect of global markets, right? And they are largely dominated by a handful of companies that dictate a lot of what happens in the food sector. So just to put it into perspective for you, there's about 4 companies that control 80% of the beef packing in North America, 62% of flour milling. 4 companies control 62% of Canada's food retail, and only 5 companies control 80% of the globe's crop seeds. Those are staggering numbers. This degree of consolidation and control is really unprecedented. During the 2008 food crisis, one of the largest grain traders posted profits that were 86% higher than the previous year. Profits that were made during a global crisis of high food prices, which drove over 100 million people into hunger. In today's agri-food system, hunger is actually good for business. According to Food Secure Canada, corporations and global capital have undue influence and control over the food system, operating beyond the reach of government or public oversight. Rather than being recognized as a biological requirement for life, it has turned food into a volatile commodity. So this is in pretty stark contrast to the rest of human history, where food and food production has been based with farmers and communities, and has really been this integral part of society, not just part of calorie consumption. It's actually been part of our culture, and we've really moved away from that. So the third trend is the loss of resilience in the food system. So over the last 60 years, agriculture has really been focused on this idea of intensification and efficiency, right? In the process of doing that, we have managed to select a narrowing number of crops, and within those crop species that are conducive to being produced in a very mechanized, industrialized kind of way. Add on top of that the requirement to have to ship well and travel well, you really end up with a pretty narrow amount of genotypes and genetics that are left in that pool. The FAO, which is estimates that at least 1 breed of traditional livestock are disappearing every week. They also estimate that over 75% of crop genetic diversity has disappeared over the last century. This is amazing. And this is at a time where globally it's recognized that in the face of climate change, we absolutely need that biological diversity to try to find mechanisms and try to find species that are going to help us cope with our impending challenges of climate change. So in addition to genetic erosion, we've also had the loss of traditional food systems and traditional ways of producing food, ways that are really based on a deep knowledge of land and water dynamics of region-based food production. These ways of knowing and these ways of producing food are actually pretty quickly disappearing from our global knowledge base. So this comes at a time where we really need place-based knowledge and genetic diversity more than we ever have in human history. Okay, so I'll end with one positive note, just so you don't all go home and cry. People are re-engaging with food, and I think anyone in this room recognizes that there is an enormous movement of individuals globally understanding the concept of local food, what it means. You know, you can go to any grocery store and even they're marketing local foods. There's been all kinds of community-supported agriculture endeavors coming up. There's all sorts of things happening globally where people are saying, hey, wait a minute, I actually don't know who my farmer is. I should find that out. And really encouraging and finding ways to get involved. In our program in Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems, I've been so excited to work with some of the young people that want to get into farming, which is new. For the last 50 years, there hasn't been an influx of young people wanting to get into industrial agriculture. It's not a delightful place to go. And so the fact that we have young people that are really excited about growing food is exciting. And they will grow food in a more engaging and a more sustainable way. So the challenge of feeding a growing population in the face of climate change, water and energy, is no small task. And it likely doesn't have one globally relevant answer, right? The future likely lies in regional, local-based food systems that are probably going to look different from one region to the other. And the innovation will be required in how we link those regional food systems and how we interface them and how we complement each other. There's lots of potential out there to rethink how we do it. And it's exciting to know that there are more and more great young minds thinking about this and really coming up with ways to move forward in addressing this imminent and big food challenge, but also to harness the endless opportunities that actually exist, exciting opportunities that exist in redefining how we produce food.
So it's always nice being at the end of a panel, especially when the other people do all of your work for you. They've also covered a bunch of the negative stuff, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the positives, which is always kind of a fun thing to do. I guess to begin, the question that we were kind of put forth with was what was driving the different megatrends. And the good news about what was driving the megatrends and what is driving the megatrends is that it's the same thing that's been driving the megatrends for the past, 50, 100 years plus. There's a nice little acronym that Paul Ehrlich uses called HIPPO, which is habitat loss, invasives, pollution, population, and overharvesting. And you could call the last one kind of also overconsumption. And that's really what's driving all of these trends. Where that leads us is to what this panel is all about, which is the nexus. And I think that is one of the key takeaways from today. We are at a point where we are hitting true kind of limits to growth. It's not everywhere on the planet, but in many cases, we are running out of one of the three of the things that each of us represent at this table. Water is representing a constraint to food production or to energy production, or energy is a constraint to food production, or one of the different things in all of that. And I think what we're starting to see is the results of that. We see increased costs, but I find it fascinating seeing some of the emerging other results of this that are almost unspoken of right now, but I think we are starting to see more of. So the latest one for me has been Crimea. Obviously in the news, a lot of people are aware of it. It's a lot of political shenanigans going on all sides. And regardless of where you stand on it, from my perspective as kind of a water professional in the whole thing, the fascinating thing is Crimea doesn't have food, energy, water independence at all. It's completely reliant upon the Ukraine for its water and energy services. In turn, the Ukraine is reliant upon Russia for its energy. So you see how these connections of sort of food, energy, water security actually are in behind a lot of the political discussions that are going on. And literally those are the conversations that are happening somewhere else in the world as we speak. So I think we are going to see increased conflict going forward on a lot of this stuff, but as I said, I'm going to focus on, from here out, the rest of the positives in all of this, which is I think we're seeing great responses to some of these things. So from a water perspective, we are starting to see pricing mechanisms that are beginning to emerge. We are seeing a much better handle on groundwater, which we've been historically sticking a pipe into the ground and sucking on it and not knowing how much is down there even, until we kind of run out and then go, oh, wow, we needed that. I think you're seeing a response in building codes, and you're going to see more response on that. I think there will be innovation on gray water use in particular, but blue water harvesting and thinking about that in a residential and commercial context. We're seeing it in some of the markets already, be it Australia and so forth, but the building code will begin to address this. From a technology perspective, this is perhaps one of the most fascinating things, and I'm hugely thankful for the generation that is sort of in behind me, so to speak, that is driving this hugely. We are now in a world almost that is like Star Trek with smartphones. We have little devices that can optimize, can tell us so much about the world around us, and that's only going to increase and continue. What's cool about that is not only are those things, telling us about our local conditions, but they're hooking into global systems. So we're now able to measure groundwater in a way from satellite data that it just simply wasn't possible 10 years ago. And so we're starting to have new information, which is critical to address the challenge that we all face, which is how do you optimize all of these things? Those smart systems, though, are going to be critical. We need to have smarter systems to get at the next echelon of waste in the system and get at resource efficiency. We need to have real-time information, not projections, not historical estimates, but real-time information. The cool thing for me is I'm seeing this happen in rural India. And if it can happen in rural India, it can happen anywhere. They have like smartphones and little, like, I mean, you're in a village in the middle of nowhere and they've got cell phones, a satellite hookup, and a weather station that's hooking them into real-time weather that they're adjusting their crop plantings because of water availability, and they're recharging groundwater resources in those areas. And if it can happen there with low-tech and high-tech combined, that for me is really encouraging. The other neat thing from my perspective, and I love living in this world these days, is I'm an enviro person. I work for World Wildlife Fund, and I'm hardcore greenie. And the cool thing is these days I have the badass kind of corporates sitting behind me saying, yeah, what he said. And you don't often, that's just, it's so neat seeing that. World Economic Forum this past year at Davos, the world economic leaders were going, yep, it's the big issues. It's not cyber attacks. It's not weapons of mass destruction. It's not even the collapse of global financial systems. That's not what we're worried about. We're worried about energy, but energy in particular that's related to water, climate change impacts. It was like water, and a bunch of other environmental things at the top. And you're like, wow, when did this happen, So having those players in behind, you see the growth of CDP and water, the world that Christy lives in. There's now $60 trillion worth of assets and asset managers kind of putting their weight behind this and saying, we want to know what your liabilities are related to water, because this is material. When you have a mining company that runs out of water, it costs them like $100,000 an hour to be shut down because they ran out of water. So it's a real business risk, and they're thinking about that, which means you're seeing multi-billion-dollar companies tackle this in a serious way. So they're getting on the bandwagon finally after a long time of us greenies saying, hey, there's a problem here, The last couple of things I would say from my perspective is I'm also seeing a huge growing interest in the world of ecosystem services, and as they relate again to water. A lot of the ecosystem services that people are interested in are things like air pollution, but a huge aspect of it is water purification and flood prevention. We've seen everything from drought to flooding this past year in a serious way, whether you're talking in the UK or in California currently. And there are lots of parts of the world that are recognizing the role of natural infrastructure. And I think that that's a really cool and exciting new space that is emerging, and one that has a lot of potential to grow here in North America. The final thing I would say is the world of kind of waste. Some of my other kind of fellow panelists talked about the fact that California was exporting their water and so forth. The problem is a whole bunch of the water that sits in those strawberries that are sitting in your fridge in January will sit and rot, or we'll throw them out. And food waste in particular, when each of those things, when a kilo of beef is 6,000 liters of water to produce and you let it rot in your fridge, you've just flushed 6,000 liters down the toilet effectively. And so getting at waste is going to be a really important thing. It links back to the earlier thing I was talking about. Having smart systems like an RFID tag that says, you know what, you need to eat your beef. You only got another day or two before it starts going off, and it reminds you on your cell phone and gives you a tasty beef stroganoff meal for the evening. That's what we're going to need. And that's what's coming, which is really cool to me. The collaborative economy, I think, is a really cool new space, and I hope people are beginning to engage in that. It's a great way to get at a lot of the things that we're talking about, relocalizing food, getting into that production, trading that off, and sharing resources in a way that we have not thought about historically. We're going to need to do those sorts of things, and we're going to frankly be driven to it, partly because it's going to be a cost-effective solution, and partly because it's fun. You get to meet people, it builds community, it builds culture. And I think that's something that a lot of people are craving. So in conclusion, what I would say is the future in front of us is a resource-constrained space. But the fun thing about that is it presents huge opportunities and interesting things that we can solve these problems. And going forward, I think one of the things that has held me back in almost wanting to posit solutions on some of these sorts of things is you feel a little powerless when you face it in a global context. The information that was spoken about in terms of how constrained the food system is, from a WWF perspective, that's awesome news. We have to tackle 4 companies, and we've changed 80% of the supply chain on the planet. If we can do that, all of a sudden we've just changed 80%. So you can see the positive spin on some of those things from a global perspective. In a local perspective, I think we're going to have to optimize food, energy, and water we're going to need to bear in mind global, but we're going to need to do it in a local context. Thinking about a catchment, the food that's there, the energy that's there, how you can have distributed local energy, distributed local food, and distributed local water, and use those things and optimize them in a smart way. And that's the future in front of us. So that's how we're going to engage, and I think it makes it very tangible for any of us in our own communities to play a role in solving these challenges. So, thank you.
Okay. Well, that was fantastic. There's 1,000 things I would love to say and questions I have. So hopefully nobody has anything to say or ask. But I'm guessing that's not true. Yes?
Two of you mentioned about pricing for carbon as well as water, and that raises really big red flags just with me personally. I work in an Aboriginal community right now, and we face a lot of energy poverty is a huge thing, and also water security across the globe. Like, how do you account for people who won't be able to afford that price? That is most of the population, I think, of the planet. Also, how do you account for water in nature? If you're putting a price on water, then who is controlling how much water is going to be preserved for the caribou, for instance?
This is a really good question, and we were confined to 8 minutes, so I plead guilty totally in terms of your point, because I would have liked to expand it much more. Pricing isn't the only thing we do, and if we don't have regulation as well, but my political experience is in Canada is that you will not get water allocation. That politically is a non-starter for a whole variety of reasons which are not particularly palatable in terms of politics. So if our best solution is not available to us, how do we get started? And one of the things that really bothers me in Alberta is that we have huge water users who are in fact paying virtually nothing for the real cost of that water. And so when I look at what is immediately possible, I see water pricing as an opportunity to begin to do it. If you drive from Calgary to Medicine Hat and through to Saskatchewan on a hot August day, and you see the huge arcing irrigation that's taking place there, the water up 100 feet into the air before it comes down, and the huge amount of sort of cloud-like film coming off it. Well, if we had a pricing for water, that would be uneconomic. We wouldn't get the Israeli system, I can assure you, but we'd at least begin to get some realistic aspects of it. And the last point I'd like to make on this is that our water laws in this country, in so many instances, were designed for a settler community, for a community which was branching out with a farm and agricultural background in connection with it and trying to support it. Today, that's so far gone, it's really not only irrelevant, it's very dangerous in terms of what we're going forward. I like your question. I would add the regulatory context that also has to be filled in here. And I believe, as a person who has worked for First Nations at a part of my life, that First Nations have to have a kind of first access to water supply and to clean water supply in a way that they don't have today.
The only other thing I guess I would add is that, water's not a commodity. It's a fundamental human right. And it distinguishes it for everything else practically on the planet. And if you're putting a price on water, which I think we need to because it does drive the drip technologies and so forth and makes things work, you have to have it structured in such a way that people's basic needs are met, first of all, at almost zero cost. I think everybody should actually pay, even if it's a cent, because it recognizes that there is value to things in that sense, but making it affordable to those who can't otherwise afford it is critical. And the challenge that is faced by First Nations here is considerable. It's disturbing, and it's continues to be a gross point of negligence on behalf of government and business in Canada. But it's in certain contexts globally, it's 1,000-fold, almost worse. There's billions of people that lack access to water in the most basic ways around the planet. So this is a global challenge, not just a Canadian one. And we do need to set up pricing systems that make it accessible to the poor and those that are in need, and have transfer systems that make egregious waste balance out the needs for basic access to these things. And that would go for, it's pretty much all of our different respective things. You can set up pricing systems whereby the first tier of energy use or the first tier of whatever is quite inexpensive, and it gets more expensive from there. A lot of the ecological footprint information suggests that the top 10% of kind of wealthy Canadians or wealthy people have a hugely disproportionate ecological footprint, in part because they waste things, in part because they consume way more than the rest of us. And so getting at that and making those people pay that much more for things is going to be critical for wealth redistribution in the country and globally.
Oh, yeah?
So just for Mr. Page, from a taxpayer's perspective, who is going to bear the cost of remediation of contaminated water from fracking and tar sands extraction? And the second question is associated with health costs, such as we've seen in Fort Chipewyan Indian Band. Who is going to bear those costs, which are associated with environmental contamination? And then the question for Ms. Stevenson is, what would you consider from the perspective of an institutional investor as the three most significant material risks to your investments in Canadian oil and gas assets? Thanks.
Okay, first of all, thanks very much. First of all, right now, the regulatory regimes in most areas of North America are totally inadequate in terms of dealing with the fracking issues. So right off the bat, we're dealing with, whether it's North Dakota or whether it's Alberta or whether it's British Columbia, we're dealing with governments that are trying to catch up at this time. Will they fully cover those costs? No. In Alberta today, and this is part of the reason why I emphasized in my talk the revolution that we're going through right now between conventional and non-conventional. Most of the law is designed in terms of drilling requirements. Porosity and other questions really come back to the conventional aspects. And so
you're absolutely right in pointing to this as a very major deficiency in connection with it. The health costs are an equally serious issue in connection with it. We're seeing in the Athabasca area of Alberta today very considerable controversy between scientists and some First Nations on one side and the government authorities on the other, on the both on what are the origins of the causes of those health problems, because those health problems reoccur in areas long distant from the oil sands. Are the oil sands contributing to it? That's one of the things that we're certainly trying to document scientifically right now. Is it likely? I say likely because we're still hard at work on this, that there is some correlation here. I believe that there is, and Fort Chip and other communities are facing with some of the statistics some evidence there that I think is critical. So on both your points, on the remediation costs in connection with fracking and the health effects, we have a classic example of the degree to which government regulation is significantly behind some of what is happening in the field. The level of public concern in these areas, however, is I think, just to give the background for those who are from outside, we have a totally new regulatory regime coming in Alberta right now, the Alberta Energy Regulator. There is a parallel and independent from government body to do the environmental assessments on oil sands, pipelines, and other related fossil fuel facilities. And those two are just underway right now, and they are a direct product of the kinds of issues that have been raised by the questioner here. It will be at least 2 years before we see the results, so there is some reason for the criticism for the delay in terms of addressing these.
Okay, so I've actually been given the signal that we are over time. So, but it's such an important discussion, I think, given Canada's economy. So I would welcome any forum to speak with you about it or any other environment to cover that. But I'm just going to now thank the panelists, and we are going to thank you very much, everyone, for your great questions.